The road is closed, but people still come. They park at the barricades and walk past the warning signs, past the no trespassing notices that nobody enforces anymore, onto a highway that hasn't carried traffic in decades. Route 61, they called it once, a state road that connected small Pennsylvania towns through the anthracite coal region. Now, it's a pilgrimage site for people who want to see what happens when the ground itself catches fire and refuses to stop burning. The pavement is buckled and cracked, split open by heat rising from below. Steam vents from fissures in the asphalt, wisps of white smoke curling up from the earth on cold mornings, proof that something is still alive down there, still burning, still consuming the coal seams that run beneath this stretch of Pennsylvania like veins of black gold. Graffiti covers every inch of the abandoned road, years of accumulated spray paint, turning the broken highway into an open-air gallery of names and dates and declarations of love and crude drawings and political slogans, layer upon layer of human marks on a landscape that humans have abandoned. The town that once stood here is mostly gone. A few houses remain, occupied by elderly residents who refuse to leave, who signed waivers acknowledging the danger and stayed anyway, who will die in Centralia because they have lived in Centralia and cannot imagine living anywhere else. The rest is empty lots and overgrown foundations, streets that lead to nothing, fire hydrants standing alone in fields where neighborhoods used to be. The churches are gone. The schools are gone. The businesses are gone. The post office closed in 1993. The zip code was revoked in 2002. Centralia, Pennsylvania, has been slowly erased from the map, deleted by a fire that started in 1962 and will burn for another 250 years. Beneath the surface, the fire spreads through abandoned mine tunnels and coal seams, moving a few feet each year, consuming fuel that accumulated over 300 million years, releasing gases that kill vegetation and make the air itself dangerous to breathe. Carbon monoxide seeps up through the soil, odorless and lethal. Hydrogen sulfide adds a rotten egg smell to certain areas, a warning that the ground you're standing on might open up and swallow you, might drop you into a burning void that has no bottom anyone has ever found. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was walking through his grandmother's backyard when the ground opened beneath his feet. A sinkhole 4 feet wide and 150 feet deep appeared without warning, and Todd fell into it, saved only by grabbing a tree root as he dropped into a pit filled with steam and carbon monoxide. His cousin pulled him out. The temperature at the bottom of the hole was measured at over 350 degrees. If he had fallen a few more feet, if the root had broken, if his cousin had been a few seconds slower, Todd Domboski would have died in his grandmother's backyard, killed by a fire that had been burning for 19 years and would keep burning for centuries more. That incident finally convinced the federal government that Centralia could not be saved. The town that had been home to over 1,000 people would have to be abandoned, its residents relocated, its buildings demolished, its history erased by a fire that nobody could extinguish and nobody fully understood. How does a town catch fire and burn for generations? How do you evacuate a community that has existed for over a century? How do you tell people that the ground beneath their homes, the earth their grandparents walked on, has become a slow-motion disaster that will outlast everyone they have ever known? This is the story of Centralia, Pennsylvania, the fire that will not die, the town that refused to leave, and the questions that remain, unanswered, rising like smoke from cracks in the abandoned highway. If you find value in investigations of American forgotten places, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which abandoned town to explore next. Your engagement makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the fire, before the evacuation, before Centralia became the most famous ghost town in America, the anthracite coal region of northeastern Pennsylvania was once the energy capital of the United States, a landscape of black mountains and burning culm banks and towns that existed only because of what lay beneath them. The hard, dense coal found here burned hotter and cleaner than the softer, bituminous coal found elsewhere, making it the preferred fuel for heating homes in eastern cities, powering factories that drove the Industrial Revolution, and feeding the furnaces of an economy that consumed energy at rates the world had never seen. Anthracite was different from other coal. It was older, compressed over hundreds of millions of years into a dense, shiny rock that was almost pure carbon. It burned with a blue flame and left little ash. It produced more heat per pound than any other coal, and it was difficult to ignite, requiring higher temperatures to start burning. But once it started, it was equally difficult to extinguish. This characteristic, the stubborn persistence of anthracite fire, would prove crucial to understanding what happened in Centralia. The mining of anthracite transformed northeastern Pennsylvania from forested wilderness into an industrial landscape unlike any other in America. By the late 19th century, the region produced over 100 million tons of coal annually, extracted by hundreds of thousands of workers who descended into mines that extended thousands of feet below the surface. The wealth that flowed from these mines built Philadelphia and powered New York and heated homes from Boston to Baltimore. Towns sprouted wherever coal could be extracted, communities built on top of the resource that gave them purpose and prosperity. They had names like Shamokin and Shenandoah and Mahanoy City, names that echoed the Native American heritage of a land that had been transformed beyond recognition. The towns were rough and dangerous, filled with immigrant workers from Ireland and Wales and Eastern Europe, men who knew that the mines might kill them, but who had no better options in the economies they had left behind. Centralia was founded in 1866, incorporated from parts of Conyngham Township, one of dozens of mining towns carved into the Pennsylvania hills. The name came from a founder who wanted to honor the central location among the surrounding coal operations, though local legend also connected it to the Civil War and the Union cause. Whatever its origin, Centralia grew quickly in its early decades, fed by the insatiable demand for anthracite coal. At its peak in the early 20th century, Centralia had over 2,700 residents. The town had churches representing a dozen ethnic traditions: Catholic churches for the Irish and Polish and Lithuanian immigrants, Orthodox churches for the Ukrainians and Russians, Protestant churches for the Welsh and English who had brought mining expertise from the old country. Schools educated children who would grow up to work the same mines their fathers and grandfathers had worked, continuing a tradition of underground labor that seemed as permanent as the coal seams themselves. The business district served a community that had every reason to believe it would last forever. General stores and hardware shops, taverns and restaurants, a movie theater and a hotel, all the infrastructure of a town that expected to persist for generations. The houses climbed the hillsides above the mines, modest frame structures that miners purchased with wages earned 1,000 feet underground, homes that represented stability and achievement in an industry that offered neither security nor safety. The mines ran beneath the town in a labyrinth of tunnels and shafts that extended for miles in every direction, a three-dimensional maze that no surface map could adequately represent. The miners followed the coal seams wherever they led, digging horizontal passages called gangways and vertical shafts that connected different levels of the underground network. The coal seams pitched and rolled with the geology, sometimes level and sometimes tilted at steep angles, and the tunnels followed them through rock that was always threatening to collapse, through water that was always threatening to flood, through air that was always threatening to turn poisonous. Some tunnels ran directly beneath the streets of Centralia, beneath the houses where miners' families slept, beneath the churches where they worshipped on Sundays before descending into darkness on Monday mornings. The miners knew this. Their families knew this. Everyone in a coal town understood that the ground they walked on was hollow, that their homes floated on a shell of rock above voids that extended in every direction, that the stability of the surface was an illusion maintained by pillars of coal left in place to support the ceilings of worked-out mines. The mining companies extracted what they could reach economically, then moved on when the easily accessible coal was exhausted. They left behind a honeycomb of abandoned tunnels, some properly sealed with concrete and earth, some simply abandoned and forgotten, their entrances collapsed or boarded up, their maps filed in offices that would eventually close, their existence remembered only by the men who had worked them and who would eventually die, without passing on what they knew. By the middle of the 20th century, the anthracite industry was dying. Oil and natural gas had replaced coal as the preferred heating fuels. The mines that had employed thousands now employed hundreds, then dozens, then none. The towns built on coal struggled to find new purposes, new industries, new reasons to exist. Centralia's population fell from its peak to around 1,400 by 1960, still a functioning community but diminished, aging, uncertain of its future. The fire started, as many disasters do, with a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. Centralia had a trash problem. The town's landfill, located in an abandoned strip mine pit at the edge of town, had been used for decades to dispose of municipal waste. The pit was supposed to be cleaned out periodically, but enforcement was lax and the trash accumulated. By May 1962, the landfill was overflowing, a mess of garbage that residents complained about and town officials struggled to address. The solution they chose was the same solution that had been used before: burn it. Controlled burning of landfill waste was common practice in that era, before environmental regulations made it illegal. The town council hired 5 members of the volunteer fire company to clean up the landfill before Memorial Day, when the cemetery adjacent to the dump would be visited by families honoring their dead. The firefighters set the trash on fire on May 27, 1962, let it burn for a while, and then extinguished it. Or thought they did. What no one realized, or perhaps what everyone realized but no one wanted to acknowledge, was that the landfill sat directly above an abandoned coal mine. The pit had been created by strip mining, which had removed the surface coal but left deeper seams intact. Those seams connected to the network of abandoned tunnels that ran beneath Centralia, tunnels filled with coal pillars that had been left in place to support the ceilings, tunnels that provided both fuel and oxygen for a fire that would find its way underground and never come back up. Within days, residents near the landfill noticed that the fire was still burning. Smoke rose from the ground in areas away from the original dump, curling up from the earth in places where no trash had ever been deposited. The smell of burning coal drifted through neighborhoods, acrid and distinctive, unmistakable to people who had grown up around mines. The coal seam beneath the landfill had ignited, and the fire was spreading through the underground tunnels, moving slowly but inexorably through the abandoned mine network that honeycombed the earth beneath Centralia. The first attempts to extinguish the fire were inadequate and underfunded, responses calibrated to a small local problem rather than the geological disaster that was actually unfolding. Workers dug trenches to try to isolate the burning area, excavating down to bedrock to create barriers that the fire could not cross. But the fire had already spread beyond the trenches before they were completed, had found pathways through the underground maze that surface observers could not see, had established itself in areas that the trenches could not reach. They flushed the tunnels with water, pumping millions of gallons into the abandoned mines in hopes of drowning the fire. But the heat was too intense. The water turned to steam on contact with the burning coal, and the steam vented through cracks and fissures, and the fire kept burning as if the water had never been applied. The coal seams were so thick, the tunnels so extensive, the heat so intense, that water alone could not overcome what was happening underground. They tried to excavate the burning coal itself, digging out the material that was feeding the fire, removing fuel to starve the flames, but the fire extended deeper than their equipment could reach, spread wider than their excavations could encompass, advanced faster than they could dig. Every excavation seemed to provide more oxygen to feed the flames, opening new pathways for air to reach coal that had been burning in limited oxygen conditions. The early efforts failed, not because the people involved were incompetent, but because the problem was larger than anyone understood. The maps of the abandoned mines were incomplete, showing some tunnels and missing others, representing a partial view of an underground world that had been worked for generations. No one knew exactly where the tunnels ran. No one knew exactly how far the fire had spread. The uncertainty was fundamental, built into a situation that had been created by a century of mining without comprehensive documentation. State and federal agencies got involved as the fire persisted and spread. The Pennsylvania Department of Mines sent engineers to assess the situation. The Bureau of Mines, the federal agency responsible for mining safety, conducted studies and proposed solutions. But their efforts were hampered by lack of funding, bureaucratic delays, and fundamental uncertainty about what they were dealing with. The federal government was reluctant to spend large sums on a small town's fire problem. The state government was reluctant to take primary responsibility for what seemed like a local issue. The borough of Centralia had no resources to address a disaster of this scale. The fire fell into a gap between jurisdictions, between levels of government, between the mining industry that had created the conditions and the public agencies that were supposed to protect citizens from harm. Through the 1960s, various projects were proposed, debated, funded inadequately, and abandoned incomplete. A flushing project in 1962 failed to extinguish the fire. An excavation project in 1963 removed some burning material but left the deeper fire untouched. A fly ash barrier project in 1965 attempted to seal the fire into a limited area, but was underfunded and unsuccessful. Each failed project consumed money and time and hope, while the fire continued spreading through the underground maze at its own unhurried pace. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the fire spread slowly but steadily beneath Centralia, advancing through the coal seams at a rate that varied with the geology and the availability of oxygen. Residents learned to live with it, or tried to, adapting to a situation that had no precedent and no clear resolution. They noticed that their basements were warmer than they should be, that the concrete floors radiated heat from below, that the air in their cellars was stale and sometimes foul-smelling. They saw steam rising from their yards on cold mornings, ghostly plumes that marked the places where the fire had advanced closest to the surface. They smelled sulfur and carbon monoxide in concentrations that worried health officials but never quite reached the levels that would force immediate action. Some residents installed carbon monoxide detectors, primitive versions of the devices that would later become standard in American homes. The detectors went off regularly, especially in basements and ground floor rooms, warning of gas levels that could cause headaches and nausea and, in high enough concentrations, death. Families learned which rooms were safe and which were not, which windows to keep open and which doors to keep closed, how to live in a house that was slowly being poisoned from below. The children of Centralia grew up knowing that their town was different, that the ground beneath their feet was burning, that the steam vents and warm spots in their yards were not normal features of the Pennsylvania landscape. They played in streets that might someday collapse into sinkholes, walked to schools built above abandoned mine tunnels, accepted as ordinary a situation that the rest of the world would have found extraordinary. The psychological toll was harder to measure than the physical dangers. Residents lived with uncertainty that never resolved, with danger that never quite materialized into catastrophe, but never went away either. They watched their property values decline as word of the fire spread, as potential buyers learned that Centralia was built above an underground inferno. They saw their neighbors move away, one family at a time, the community shrinking as those who could leave chose to leave. The fire was there, beneath them, burning. But life went on. People went to work and came home. Children went to school. Churches held services. The remaining businesses served the remaining customers. Centralia continued functioning as a town even as the ground beneath it smoldered, even as the evidence of the fire became more visible year by year. The town's population continued to decline as the fire spread. Some people left because they were frightened, because the health warnings finally convinced them that staying was too dangerous, because they could not sleep at night knowing what was burning beneath their beds. Others left because the economic opportunities had dried up along with the mines, because the young people had no jobs to stay for, because the future of Centralia seemed to hold nothing but continued decline. By 1980, Centralia had fewer than 1,000 residents, a shrinking community sitting on top of a growing fire, waiting for something to happen that would force a decision about whether the town could survive or whether it would have to be abandoned entirely. Todd Domboski's fall into the sinkhole in 1981 was that something. The image of a 12-year-old boy nearly swallowed by the burning earth galvanized attention that decades of warnings had failed to achieve. Suddenly, Centralia was national news, a symbol of government failure and environmental disaster, a town that was literally falling into hell. The federal government allocated $42 million for a voluntary relocation program, offering to buy the homes of residents who wanted to leave. The program was administered by the Department of the Interior, which sent appraisers to assess property values and negotiators to make offers to homeowners who had few other options. The state condemned properties deemed most at risk, using emergency powers to declare buildings uninhabitable and force residents to vacate. The offers were controversial from the start. The government argued that fair market value was zero or close to it. The residents argued that they were being cheated, that their homes were worth more than the pittances being offered, that the same government that had failed to extinguish the fire was now profiting from its failure. The debate that followed split the community in ways that old friendships could not bridge. Those who wanted to accept the buyouts and leave argued that staying was suicidal, that the fire was spreading, that eventually everyone would have to go, and it was better to go now with some compensation than to wait until the houses were worthless. Those who refused to leave argued that the government was exaggerating the danger, that the relocation was a land grab, that their families had built Centralia and they would not be driven out by bureaucrats who had never lived there. Families who had been neighbors for generations stopped speaking to each other. Churches divided between those who counseled acceptance and those who counseled resistance. The social fabric of Centralia, already weakened by decades of decline, tore apart under the pressure of a decision that no community should have to make. Most residents eventually accepted the buyouts, taking whatever compensation they could get, signing the papers that transferred their properties to the government, packing their belongings into moving trucks and driving away from the only homes they had ever known. They scattered to nearby towns, Ashland, Mount Carmel, Shamokin, joining other communities that were themselves struggling with the decline of the anthracite industry. Between 1985 and 1991, over 500 homes were purchased by the government and demolished. The demolitions were systematic and thorough. Crews arrived with bulldozers and excavators and reduced houses to rubble within hours. The rubble was hauled away. The foundations were filled with dirt. The lots were graded and seeded with grass. Within months, streets that had been lined with homes became rows of empty lots, indistinguishable from the fields that had existed before Centralia was founded. The churches came down. The schools came down. The businesses came down. The post office closed in 1993. The mail redirected to Ashland. The zip code that had identified Centralia removed from the postal system. The municipal government struggled to function with a tax base that was evaporating, with infrastructure that still required maintenance, with services that still had to be provided to the residents who remained. By 2002, the zip code was officially revoked, the final administrative acknowledgement that Centralia had ceased to exist as a functioning community. The borough technically still existed, but it had no services, no government, no purpose except as a legal entity that owned land above a burning coal seam. Centralia, Pennsylvania, had been slowly erased from the map, deleted by a fire that started with a trash burn and would continue for centuries. But some refused to leave. A handful of residents, mostly elderly, rejected the buyouts and stayed in their homes despite the warnings, despite the danger, despite the knowledge that the fire was still burning beneath them and would keep burning long after they were dead. They had their reasons, as varied and personal as the individuals who stayed. Some stayed because they had nowhere else to go. They were old, fixed in their ways, without family or resources in other places. The compensation being offered would not buy equivalent housing elsewhere. The choice was between staying in a familiar home above a fire and becoming homeless or dependent on relatives who might not want them. They chose to stay. Some stayed because they did not believe the danger was as great as the government claimed. They had lived in Centralia for decades, had breathed the air and walked the streets and slept in their beds, and they were still alive. The government had cried wolf before, had exaggerated problems to justify interventions that served bureaucratic interests rather than residents' well-being. Why should they trust the same officials who had failed to extinguish the fire in the first place? Some stayed out of principle, out of a conviction that the government had no right to force them from their homes, that property rights meant something, that a citizen should not be evicted because of a problem the government had created through its own incompetence. They saw the relocation as theft, the buyouts as coercion, the condemnations as tyranny. They would not cooperate with what they viewed as injustice, regardless of the consequences. Some stayed because Centralia was home in a way that could not be replicated elsewhere. They had been born here, married here, raised children here, buried parents and grandparents here. Their memories were inscribed in these streets, these buildings, this landscape. To leave would be to become a refugee, to abandon not just a house, but an identity. They would rather die in Centralia than live anywhere else. They signed liability waivers releasing the government from responsibility for their safety. They accepted that emergency services might not reach them in time if something went wrong, that the fire department might not come if their house caught fire, that the ambulance might not arrive if they had a heart attack. They accepted the risk because the alternative, leaving, was worse than any risk they could imagine. The legal battles over Centralia dragged on for years, decades, consuming millions of dollars in legal fees and generating thousands of pages of court documents. Residents who had left sued for more compensation, arguing that the buyouts had been inadequate, that their properties had been worth more than the government paid. Some won additional settlements, most lost. Residents who stayed fought condemnation orders, challenging the government's right to declare their homes uninhabitable, demanding due process and just compensation and all the protections that property owners are supposed to enjoy. The state invoked eminent domain to seize properties it deemed dangerous, arguing that public safety trumped individual rights, that the government had a duty to protect people even from themselves. The cases went through the Pennsylvania courts, up and down the appellate system, generating precedents about eminent domain and police power and the limits of government authority. The remaining residents won some battles and lost others. They delayed evictions and challenged procedures and made the government work for every house it took, but they could not stop the process entirely. One by one, even some of the holdouts gave up, accepted final settlements, moved away. By 2010, Centralia's population had fallen to 10 people in a town that had once held thousands, living in houses scattered across a landscape of empty lots and abandoned streets, surrounded by warning signs and no trespassing notices that they ignored every day, simply by existing where they existed. They were the last residents of Centralia, the final human presence in a community that had otherwise returned to nature. The state stopped trying to evict them, recognizing that these final residents would die in Centralia one way or another, and that forcing them out would cost more in legal fees and public relations damage than simply letting them stay. A kind of truce developed between the remaining residents and the authorities, an agreement to disagree, a mutual decision to let time resolve what courts could not. Today, 7 residents remain. Their average age is over 70. They maintain their homes with the stubbornness of people who have chosen their hill to die on and mean it literally. They tend their gardens, repair their roofs, shovel their walks in winter, perform all the maintenance tasks that homeowners perform everywhere, in houses that happen to sit above a fire that will burn for centuries. They know each other, these 7 survivors, though they are not necessarily friends. The shared experience of staying has not created a community so much as a collection of individuals who happen to have made the same choice for their own different reasons. They wave to each other when they pass on the street. They check in occasionally to make sure everyone is still alive. They share the experience of being the last, the holdouts, the ones who refuse to go. The visitors who come to Centralia today often seek out these remaining residents, knocking on doors to ask questions about the fire and the evacuation and what it feels like to live in a ghost town. Some residents welcome the attention, enjoy the opportunity to tell their stories, appreciate being recognized as something other than stubborn old people refusing to accept reality. Others resent the intrusion, the tourists who treat their homes as exhibits, the photographers who shoot pictures without permission, the journalists who want a quote for stories that never quite capture what living here actually means. The fire continues spreading, moving through the coal seams at a rate of about 75 feet per year, consuming an estimated 37 acres so far, and threatening hundreds more. The burning zone now extends well beyond Centralia's original boundaries, approaching the neighboring town of Burnsville, which was also evacuated, and potentially threatening other communities in the anthracite region. The fire could eventually affect an area of 3,700 acres before it exhausts the available coal, a process that might take 250 years or more. No serious effort to extinguish the fire has been attempted since the 1980s. The cost estimates were too high, the technical challenges too great, the political will too weak. Every study reached the same conclusion. Extinguishing the Centralia fire would be extraordinarily difficult, and might not even be possible with existing technology. One proposal involved complete excavation, digging out every burning coal seam, every smoldering tunnel, every pocket of underground fire, and removing the fuel that kept the blaze alive. Studies suggested that this approach might cost $600 to $60 million and would require years of work, with no guarantee of success. The fire had spread through areas that were difficult to map and harder to reach. Excavation might simply expose new fuel to oxygen and spread the fire faster than it could be removed. Another proposal involved flooding the mine tunnels, pumping enough water into the underground network to submerge the fire and deprive it of oxygen. But the volume of water required would be enormous, the pumping costs astronomical, and the water would have to be maintained indefinitely. Any reduction in flooding would allow the fire to reignite from embers that could smolder underwater for years, and the flooded tunnels might simply channel water away from the fire through pathways that engineers could not predict, leaving the blaze to continue burning while the water drained away. A third proposal involved sealing the mine network, closing every opening through which air could reach the fire, suffocating the blaze by depriving it of the oxygen it needed to burn. But the abandoned mines beneath Centralia were never fully mapped. There were openings that no one knew about, cracks and fissures and ventilation shafts that had been forgotten for decades. Sealing the known openings might reduce the fire's oxygen supply without eliminating it entirely. And the pressure of gases building up in a sealed mine network could cause explosions or force new pathways to the surface. Every solution was expensive, uncertain, and politically unpalatable. The federal government did not want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a town that had already been largely evacuated. The state government did not want to take responsibility for a project that might fail publicly. No politician wanted to be associated with a $660 million excavation project that might not work, that might make things worse, that would certainly be attacked by opponents as wasteful spending. So the fire burns. It has burned through 12 presidents, through the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the Internet, through the transformation of American society in ways that the residents of 1962 Centralia could never have imagined. It will burn through climate change and artificial intelligence and whatever comes next, a fire that belongs to the deep time of geology rather than the brief time of human affairs. The fire spreads through the coal seams at a rate that varies with conditions, perhaps 75 feet per year in some directions, slower or faster in others depending on the thickness of the coal, the availability of oxygen, the geometry of the underground pathways. It has consumed an estimated 37 acres so far and threatens hundreds more. The burning zone now extends well beyond Centralia's original boundaries, approaching the neighboring community of Burnsville, which was also evacuated, and potentially threatening other towns in the anthracite region. Engineers estimate that the fire could eventually affect an area of 3,700 acres before it exhausts the available coal. At current rates of spread, that process might take 250 years or more. The fire will be burning in 2027 in a world that we cannot imagine, for reasons that the people of that time will have to research in historical archives. There are other burning towns, other underground fires that have resisted every attempt to extinguish them. A coal seam fire in Burning Mountain, Australia, has been burning for an estimated 6,000 years, ignited by lightning in an era before humans reached that continent. Still smoldering today beneath a mountain that gives off enough heat to burn the boots of hikers who wander too close. Fires burn beneath the coal fields of China and India, consuming millions of tons of coal annually, releasing carbon dioxide and methane into an atmosphere already stressed by human emissions. Some of these fires were ignited by mining operations. Others started spontaneously when coal exposed to air began to oxidize and heat up. They burn through villages and farmland and wilderness, defying every effort at control, contributing to climate change while demonstrating the limits of human mastery over geological forces. Centralia is unique only in its visibility, its location in a developed country where such things are not supposed to happen. Its slow-motion evacuation, documented by journalists and photographers and filmmakers over decades. It has become a symbol, a cautionary tale, a tourist attraction, a curiosity, a destination for people who want to see what happens when the Earth itself rebels against the humans who live on it. The visitors who come to Centralia today walk the abandoned highway and take photographs of the steam rising from the cracks. They explore the empty streets and peer into the yards of the few remaining houses, sometimes knocking on doors to ask questions of residents who have answered the same questions 1,000 times. They are drawn by curiosity and morbidity, by the desire to see something that seems impossible, a town killed by the earth itself, a place where the ground is burning and people still live. The graffiti highway that was once Route 61 became the most famous feature of modern Centralia, more famous than the fire itself in some ways. When the state rerouted traffic away from the burning area in the 1990s, the abandoned section of highway became an unofficial canvas, a place where visitors could leave their marks on a landscape that was already marked by disaster. The graffiti accumulated layer upon layer, year after year, transforming the broken pavement into a sprawling outdoor gallery. Names and dates marked visits from across the country and around the world. Declarations of love memorialized relationships that may or may not have survived. Political slogans and obscene drawings and artistic murals competed for space on every available surface. The graffiti highway became a destination in itself, drawing thousands of visitors each year who came specifically to add their marks to the collective artwork. The state finally decided to address the situation in 2020, sending crews to cover the graffiti-covered road with dirt, burying the accumulated artwork under tons of fill, trying to discourage the visitors who kept coming, despite every effort to close the area. The burial was controversial, mourned by some as the destruction of folk art, and welcomed by others as the end of a nuisance. But the visitors came anyway, walking farther to reach the parts of the road that weren't buried, finding new surfaces to spray, refusing to let Centralia fade into the obscurity that authorities seemed to want. The remaining residents have complex relationships with the visitors and the attention. Some welcome the interest, seeing it as validation that their town mattered, that their decision to stay was meaningful rather than merely stubborn. The visitors prove that Centralia is not forgotten, that the story still resonates, that the place still has the power to draw people from their ordinary lives to witness something extraordinary. Others resent the intrusion. They dislike the tourists who treat their homes as exhibits in an open-air museum, who photograph their houses without asking, who knock on their doors expecting interviews, who leave trash and noise and disruption in their wake. They dislike the journalists who tell the same story over and over without ever really understanding what living here actually means. They dislike being curiosities, specimens, the last survivors of a disaster that other people find entertaining. What does it mean to live in Centralia? What does it mean to stay in a place that has been condemned, evacuated, erased from official recognition. What does it mean to tend a garden above a fire that will burn for centuries? To sleep in a bedroom that might someday collapse into a burning void? To grow old in a town where you might be the last person left? The residents who remain don't talk about it in dramatic terms. They talk about their homes, their memories, their neighbors who died or moved away. They talk about the government's failures and broken promises, the compensation that was never enough, the bureaucrats who made decisions without understanding what they were deciding. They talk about their gardens and their pets and the ordinary concerns of ordinary life, lived in an extraordinary place that feels ordinary to them because it is the only place they know. They talk about community and loyalty and the meaning of place in an America where places are increasingly interchangeable, where towns are abandoned and built and abandoned again, according to the logic of economics rather than the logic of human attachment. They stayed because Centralia meant something that could not be replaced, that could not be compensated, that could not be relocated to a new address in a different town. They know the fire is there. They know the danger is real. They have made their peace with it, or as much peace as anyone can make with the knowledge that the ground beneath their feet might someday open up and swallow everything they have. They stay because staying is what they have chosen, and choice is the last thing they have left. The fire will outlast them. It will burn through their funerals and the sales of their estates and the final demolition of their homes. It will burn through the decay of the remaining structures and the growth of new forests over the empty lots. It will burn until it reaches the natural boundaries of the coal seams, until it exhausts the fuel that has accumulated over geological time, until it finally goes out and leaves behind a landscape scarred by a century or more of burning. What will remain then? The story, perhaps. The photographs and the documentaries and the Wikipedia articles that preserve the memory of a town that burned for longer than it existed. The graffiti buried under dirt but still there, still waiting, still marking the place where a highway used to run and a town used to stand. The questions that Centralia raises about how we treat places and people, about the costs we are willing to impose on communities in the name of progress or neglect, about what we owe to the past and what we can promise to the future. Centralia is often compared to Silent Hill, the video game and movie franchise that depicts a fog-shrouded town haunted by supernatural horrors. The comparison is apt in some ways. Centralia did inspire elements of the Silent Hill mythology, gave the game designers a real-world template for their fictional nightmare. The steam rising from the ground, the abandoned streets, the sense of a place that exists between life and death. These elements translate directly from Centralia to Silent Hill, but the comparison also misses something important. Silent Hill is fiction, a constructed nightmare designed to entertain, to frighten, to provide the pleasures of horror in a controlled environment. Players and viewers can experience the terror of Silent Hill and then turn off the game, leave the theater, return to their ordinary lives unaffected by what they have witnessed. Centralia is real. It happened to real people. It is still happening. It will keep happening long after everyone who caused it and everyone who suffered from it has died. The horror of Centralia cannot be turned off. It cannot be escaped by closing a book or ending a game. It persists in the real world, burning beneath real ground, affecting real lives, raising real questions that have no comfortable answers. The real horror of Centralia is not supernatural. It is bureaucratic, economic, geological. It is the horror of decisions made without understanding their consequences, of a trash fire set without checking what lay beneath the landfill. It is the horror of problems deferred because they were expensive to solve, of a fire allowed to spread for years because extinguishing it would have cost money that no one wanted to spend. It is the horror of communities sacrificed because saving them would cost more than abandoning them, of people told that their homes were worth nothing, that their lives would have to be rebuilt elsewhere, that the places they loved were forfeit. It is the horror of deep time, of forces that operate on scales that human planning cannot comprehend. The coal beneath Centralia took 300 million years to form, accumulated grain by grain in ancient swamps, compressed by the weight of geological ages into the dense, energy-rich rock that powered the Industrial Revolution. The fire that now consumes that coal will burn for 250 years or more, long after everyone who remembers Centralia as a living town has died, long after the last building has collapsed and the last resident has been buried. Human lives are brief. Human plans are briefer. We make decisions based on the information available, on the resources at hand, on the political pressures of the moment. We cannot see 250 years into the future. We cannot anticipate every consequence of every action. We light fires and expect them to go out, build towns and expect them to last, make promises and expect to keep them. Centralia reminds us that some fires don't go out. Some towns don't last. Some promises cannot be kept. The gap between human intentions and geological reality is vast, and sometimes we fall into it, and sometimes entire communities fall into it, and there is no rescue, no solution, no happy ending. The 7 remaining residents of Centralia know this. They live with it every day. They have accepted that their town will burn for centuries, that they will die before the fire does, that the place they love will eventually be nothing but a scar on the landscape and a story in the archives. They stay anyway. They stay because staying is what they have chosen. Because home is home even when it burns. Because some things matter more than safety. The fire keeps burning. The steam keeps rising. The visitors keep coming. The residents keep staying. And the questions keep asking themselves, year after year, decade after decade, rising like smoke from cracks in the abandoned highway. How did this happen? Why did this happen? What does it mean? What should we do? The fire has no answers. The fire just burns. The 7 remaining residents do not think of themselves as living in a symbol. They think of themselves as living in their houses, on their streets, in their town. They wake up in the morning and make coffee and check on their neighbors and do the things that people do in small towns everywhere. They happen to do these things above a fire that will burn for another 250 years. But that is just the context of their lives, not the content. They will die eventually, these last residents, and their houses will be demolished or will fall down on their own, and Centralia will become truly empty, a ghost town without even the ghosts of the living to animate it. The fire will keep burning beneath the empty land, invisible except for the steam and the sinkholes and the warning signs that nobody will be left to read. Will anyone remember? Will anyone visit when there are no residents left to interview, no houses left to photograph, no graffiti left to document? Will Centralia fade into the same obscurity as the dozens of other Pennsylvania coal towns that died of ordinary economic causes, their names forgotten, their histories compressed into footnotes? Or will the fire keep Centralia alive in memory, a story too strange to forget, a place too impossible to ignore? Will future generations make pilgrimages to see the ground that burned for centuries, to walk the buried highway, to try to understand what happened here and what it meant? The fire doesn't care. The fire burns because burning is what fire does when it has fuel and oxygen and no reason to stop. The coal seams don't know that a town was built above them, that people lived and loved and died on the surface, that a community with churches and schools and dreams of permanence depended on ground that was honeycombed with tunnels and waiting for a spark. The abandoned road stretches through the landscape, buckled and broken, steam rising from cracks on cold mornings. The visitors come and take their photographs and leave, carrying images of a place that most people only know from articles and documentaries. The residents stay in their homes, growing older, waiting for whatever comes next. The fire burns. This is Centralia, Pennsylvania. Population 7. Temperature underground, 900 degrees and rising. Estimated time until fire exhaustion, 250 years, give or take a century. Status, still burning, still smoking, still refusing to die. A trash fire in 1962, a decision that seemed reasonable. A spark that found its way underground and never came back up. 60 years of burning, 60 years of evacuation and demolition, and denial and acceptance. 60 years of a town disappearing into the earth that it was built on, consumed by the same coal that had given it life in the first place. The anthracite that heated American homes in the 19th century now heats only itself, burning without purpose, serving no economy, powering nothing except its own continuation. The wealth that was extracted from these hills went elsewhere long ago. What remains is the fire and the smoke, and the 7 people who refuse to leave, and the questions that no one can answer. Why did this happen? Because decisions have consequences that extend beyond the moment of decision. Because systems are more complex than the people who manage them understand. Because fire, once started in the right conditions, will burn until it has nothing left to burn. Could it have been prevented? Perhaps. Better management of the landfill. Better mapping of the abandoned mines. Better responses in the early years, when the fire was small and might have been contained. But prevention requires foresight, and foresight requires investment, and investment requires political will. And political will requires that someone care enough about a small coal town to spend money on it before disaster strikes rather than after. Could it be stopped now? Probably not. The fire has spread too far, burned too long, reached areas too deep and too extensive to excavate or flood or smother. The technology does not exist to extinguish a fire of this scale and complexity. The money does not exist either, not for a town with 7 residents and no economic future. Centralia will burn until it stops burning on its own, and no human intervention will change that. What happens to the people? They live until they die. They stay until they cannot stay anymore. They pass away in their homes or in nursing facilities in nearby towns, and their houses are demolished and their lots returned to nature, and eventually no one is left who remembers what it was like to live in Centralia when it was a town and not a fire. The fire is patient. The fire has time. The fire will be here when the last resident is gone, when the last house is demolished, when the last visitor stops coming, when the last article is written and the last documentary is filmed. The fire will burn through all of it, indifferent, eternal, consuming the coal that took 300 million years to form in what amounts to the blink of a geological eye. Centralia, Pennsylvania, the town that burned. The fire that would not die. The people who refused to leave. A warning about consequences. A meditation on permanence. A monument to the gap between human plans and geological time. The steam still rises from the cracks in the road. The smoke still drifts from vents in the hillside. The fire still burns beneath the empty streets and the remaining houses and the overgrown lots where 1,000 people used to live. 60 years and counting. 250 years to go. Or more? Or less? Nobody knows for certain. The fire keeps its own time. The fire answers to no one. The fire will have the last word. If this story mattered to you, please consider subscribing. These investigations take time to research and produce, and your support makes them possible. Tell me in the comments, which forgotten American place should we explore next? The flooded towns of the Quabbin, the atomic city of Oak Ridge, the jungle ruins of Fordlandia, the deadliest factory fire in American history? Every place has a story. Every story has a cost. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.